I really thank you all for joining in this critical time. On behalf of the Gulf Times, I want to welcome everybody today. The whole idea of this session is to talk on the day after the war in Gulf energy, maritime, checkpoint, and reshaping the global market. As a Gulf Time, we believe that as a platform, it's more to bring smart, intelligent people together and to talk about future issues that can enhance and put the knowledge in place. So I really want to thank my colleagues first at James Baker Institute for joining, and also I want to thank Aida from the Bilateral Chamber of Commerce. I want to ask also Roy from Georgetown, and also Rashid for joining this session. It's going to be a season of 3 seasons to come. I want to cover also logistic and aviation, because I really think those are the 3 main points that got affected from this war. Aida is someone that I know from a very long time during my stay in Houston, and she's the founder of the Bilateral Chamber of Commerce in 1997. I met first Aida in Houston. And of course, the chamber is boarded by people from the industry, oil and gas, the medical, all the big players in the business industry in Houston, in the US, and also in other business sectors. Christian is also someone that I have met here in Sheraton in Doha a long time ago. And I really also welcome him in this session. He holds a PhD, he's a fellow and at the Middle Eastern Baker Institute, a coordinator of the Middle East Energy Roundtable, have studied the region and also published a very, I will advise everybody to read about it, the Qatar and the Gulf crisis. And also another important point, the center of power in the Arab Gulf states. Also, I want to introduce resource economy. He's also a fellow at the James Baker Institute, who has also deep thinking and follow on the energy sector in the Gulf and worldwide. We have also Roy Miller from Georgetown. I think also Georgetown for joining this session. And we also have Jim Kern is also a fellow at the Roundtable and the Middle East Energy Roundtable at Rice University. Again, we have a lot of James Baker Institute fellow. And also I would like to introduce Rashid Al-Muhannadi, who's a non-resident fellow in the Middle East Council and Global Affairs, who have an interesting also a background in the defense and also in the LNG sector. He also a founder of a consulting firm which specializes in defense and also economic and also security. I really will leave it to Aida to moderate the session, and I welcome also my guest for attending.
Thank you, Faisal. I'm in a very hard spot because any one of these esteemed panelists could fill by themselves a 1 hour discussion. And so we'll try to keep it interesting and keep it moving. I don't think we have to summarize, what's going on in the Gulf, where everyone here understands strikes, counter strikes, disrupted shipping, rising prices, declarations that the war is over, declarations that we have a deal, no deal. So I really want to kind of start with perhaps a talk about with Mr. Sorry, I just had him. Medlock, if you would please, Professor Medlock, in your estimation, as you look at from a macro market perspective, do you think that we've reached a critical point where this is moving beyond a regional disruption and becoming a systemic global crisis? Are we quite there yet? Because from the US side, yes, we've seen gas prices rise a little bit, but not quite where it's getting everyone's attention. They know it's happening. It feels like a little bit of pain. We're told it's temporary. Is it temporary? Is this a protracted situation from a market standpoint?
So that's a really good question, and I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for asking that one. There is a lot of uncertainty and misunderstanding, I would argue, from just a purely sort of international trade economics perspective about what's actually happening. That's driving almost a bifurcation between the Asian and the Atlantic basin, Asian markets and Atlantic basin. A lot of the Middle East crude oils that flow out end up being refined in Asian markets, and those refiners are tuned specifically to utilize those crudes to generate the types of fuels, jet fuels, distillates, things that we typically think about using every day, generally, but they're not available. And so you see a very severe constraint on the ability for those refiners to do what they normally do that's rendered itself into the market. And so anytime you have a constraint, you'll see price climb. The Pacific Basin in general, so those Asian markets are way undersupplied, and you're actually seeing those refiners actually cut runs. You're seeing in some instances countries, mandating that exports be suspended from their refineries. So this happened in China, for example, with Sinopec. But when you move to the Atlantic Basin, it's a very different looking picture, because the barrels that are in the Atlantic Basin are still finding homes. There's not a lack of liquidity. In the physical market in Asia, you have a lack of liquidity. So you have a massively constrained marketplace that is leading to a disconnect. It's actually why you've seen some of those Asian barrels trade, most recently in north of $150, right? So these are barrels that would typically be, for example, I think Kuwaiti blend yesterday traded at 163 in the spot market. That's an incredibly high price, but it's because there's a lack of substitution capability. So yes, that has dramatic implications for the Asian economies that rely on those crudes, but you're not quite seeing the same impact in the Atlantic Basin, so in the US and European markets, at least not yet. So one of the things we have to be careful about is understanding how crude flows will ultimately shift as these basis differentials persist. So if the prices in Asia continue to be as escalated as they are, will we begin to see a migration of Atlantic Basin crudes into the region? The answer is obviously yes, but there's a logistics problem that has to ultimately be solved to handle that. And it's not clear whether it'll be crude or the products themselves, so refined products. So in the United States, for example, one of the most complex refining kits in the world, you've seen an increase in exports of petroleum products over the last couple of weeks from the Gulf Coast. And that is landing everywhere around the world. So you're seeing this massive sort of adjustment logistically to deal with these price differentials. All of that said, why bring that up? And I'll come back to natural gas in just a minute, because that is a very different marketplace than oil and gasoline. When you have these kinds of extreme price spikes that we're seeing, it does bear weight on economies that feel them. It has massive implications for industrial activity, for consumer activity, particularly for countries that are importing countries. And that basically puts us squarely in the heart of the majority of Asian developing economies. They're all very heavily import dependent. And so this price spike is going to have a significant weight on those economies. Now, it's likely true that when the first quarter data are revealed sometime in the near future, you'll already see some of that very materially impacting GDP and those economies. As this drags, you'll see it matriculate or spill over into the second quarter of 2026. And the longer this drags, that's going to get deeper and deeper. So whether or not that becomes systemic really depends on how much those economies are trading with the rest of the world, which we know is substantial. And so if the inability to operate manufacturing equipment, consumer durables, et cetera, actually spills over into industrial activity and the ability to manufacture and export, then you actually see this systemic crisis emerge, because that's where you see the massive spillover effects to the rest of the world. So this is a contagion effect, effectively. The natural gas front is a little bit different. In the United States, we are not, you referenced this, we're not really seeing an impact on natural gas prices. And that's because we have been exporting at full capacity well before the onset of this crisis in the Middle East. And so even though there is more demand for natural gas that is not arriving, the U.S. simply cannot flow anymore. There was an emergency petition filed for a couple of LNG exporters that the DOE approved day before yesterday. So once those flows begin to commence, the question then becomes, will that physically impact the natural gas market in the lower 48, so in the United States and North America more generally? It's highly unlikely that it will. And that's because if you look at over-the-counter market, so regional pricing in North America, West Texas, so a hub known as Waha, has actually been trading negative for the last 4 weeks. So when you look at that, that basically means there's an oversupply condition in West Texas that indicates we're producing more than we can move. So as soon as those terminals open, it's likely that will draw up, but it's not going to physically really impact the Henry Hub price, because you have this basis differential of a bottleneck supply in Texas that will feed the terminals that have just actually received verification. They can increase up to peak capacity or peak send out in the short term. So the natural gas market is very much a disconnected, a more bifurcated market, and it's likely to remain as such simply because the U.S. can't export much more than it already does.
So that means, if I may, and I'm going to take it over to Professor Roy Miller, who himself is an energy expert, and I'd like to hear from him. But it seems that means that the American public isn't necessarily going to put a lot of pressure on the administration, right, to change things.
No, not at
they're
all.
Not really.
Yeah, no, not at all. The pressure is actually mounting from the prices at the pump. So when you talk about gasoline prices, you've already seen a significant escalation there. It is very much in line with what we historically see in terms of the relationship of the global markers and gasoline prices or prices at the pump. And that never bodes well for an incumbent in power when you see gasoline prices rise. So this will actually begin to bear political weight. It already is. I think the administration is probably hopeful that this will subside by the time we get to summer, when driving season really sort of begins to mount. And those pressures will be much greater because, of course, there are midterm elections coming up, and the political dimensions of this are very tangible. They're very real. So when you think about what this administration is going to have to do going forward to try to address the rise in the price at the pump, so gasoline prices, there's not a lot they can do other than to get the Strait of Hormuz reopened and sea flows commence. So in the short term, it does actually bear significant political weight.
Thank you. Roy, what are, from your vantage point, what are your thoughts on this? Can Russian oil being released back into the global marketplace, does that help things in the Eastern markets? Do they have enough to help mitigate what's going on?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here among such experts. I would say, just to go back to the previous point, in terms of the cost to American consumers, obviously, it's going to be felt at the pump, a petrol pump and whatnot. But there's also a bigger non-material cost, which is the cost of relationships with allies and the fallout financially, which Ken described across the globe. So it's not just the domestic consumer, it's the impact on domestic consumers in many allies and partners of the United States. And that's something that's going to take its toll on the foreign policy level. But in terms of countries like Russia, I mean, you're starting to see Russia benefit significantly in certain parts of Asia now. I think they've generated an extra $5.5 to $6 billion in sales to India in February, March, and April. It's estimated that they're going to increase their sales significantly to India in the multi-million barrels of oil a day. And of course, this has geopolitical implications as well as oil supply implications. So again, that's another impact in terms of the geopolitics of this energy shortage in the short term. And it isn't simply just major suppliers like Russia increasing their opportunities to sell in terms of volume. It's also the relationships between Russia and other major suppliers at the expense of existing Gulf producers. And again, another one is, if you look at some of the other Asian countries, it's not simply just increasing their purchase of oil from countries like Russia, it's rethinking their energy relationships with major regional players like China. Mm-hmm. So for example, the Philippines right now, it's said that they're thinking about restarting talks with China about shared energy exploration in contested maritime waters. So while it's about trying to find other supply options, which is something that governments are mandated to do, right, for all the reasons Ken spoke about in terms of potential crises, it's also impacting significantly on potential strategic and security partnerships and political relationships. And I would say, to a greater or less extent, looking at from the outside of the US, impacting negatively on the United States.
Thank you. Very good. And you make a really great point, which I'd like to take over to Christian and Jim, really in a way to both of them, and you two decide who goes first. But Gulf countries sit at the center of this crisis, obviously, geographically, economically. Do both of you have, do you think that they have meaningful leverage to shape any of this outcome? Are they ultimately constrained by the larger powers and geographically in this situation?
Sure. Oh, hi. So I'm Jim Crane. I guess I'll jump in first. Sorry, I was having some connectivity issues, but it's great to be here, and I appreciate you having me and us. Yeah, I would say the Gulf countries are severely lacking in leverage, and that's why this war is playing out on their territories. As it's turning out, I think they were working hard to build up leverage in Washington, and looked like they were succeeding. But when push comes to shove, no, it turns out yet again their leverage is not as strong as they expected, and not as strong as some other countries. So Israel is demonstrating that it still wields a lot of the cards in Washington, and when push comes to shove, when one side is pushing for a different policy than the other, we're seeing that the Israeli interests have won out again this time. I think Gulf countries have defense agreements, sort of formal and informal, open and closed agreements with the U.S. I think in the future, I think we need to look at the contents in that and try to insert more consultation with the at least get it formalized in there that before the U.S. uses its Gulf defense assets for it puts them into action. At least there's some consultation with Gulf governments. I mean, we've seen the Obama administration, now the Trump administration, launching big initiatives. Kinetic with the Trump administration, without really much consultation, or even against the wishes of the Gulf. Going forward as well, I think the Gulf countries are going to need some kind of a formalized agreement with with Iran on the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf economies and the Gulf security and the physical, buildings and people of the Gulf cannot be Iran's deterrent, right? So I think Iran needs a different deterrent to deter strikes on it, other than blocking the Strait of Hormuz and damaging the Gulf economies and buildings and safety and security. So I think that's something that we need to start digging into, as the dust starts to settle, reformulating some of these security agreements so that the Gulf doesn't face this, becoming a battleground for some conflict that it has no stake in.
We'll come back to your recommendations on sort of the way forward. Christian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Well, this is a conflict the Gulf states have always tried to avert. This is a conflict where the all-out war between Israel and the US on the one side, Iran on the other, has the Gulf in the middle, taking the brunt of all the attacks from Iran. This is the exact conflict that policymakers feared would happen, and that they feared every time we had the successive rounds of conflict in 24 and 25. The next one would be greater still, and this is what has come to pass. We obviously see the results in Qatar with 17% of LNG taken out last week, and of course the Strait of Hormuz shut for oil from Kuwait, from LNG from Qatar, from UAE. And this is where the issue of leverage that Jim was talking about comes through. The Gulf states feel intensely frustrated that in Washington they don't seem to be taking decisions with regard to the interests of the Gulf states. There's not, I think, an incomprehension as to how to reach this administration to try to see the gravity of the situation, which may escalate even further. And of course, the problem for the Gulf states, apart from Saudi Arabia, which has the coast on the Red Sea, UAE to some extent, and Oman, but for the other Gulf states, there's not really an alternative to the Strait of Hormuz. So for other choke points around the world, there are alternatives. We saw disruption in the Bab el-Mandab in the Red Sea, for example, for almost 2 years because of the Houthi attacks on shipping. But ships could sail around the coast of Africa, now added 10 to 14 days to journeys, but there were workarounds. Now we have a situation where everything is blocked, coming in and going out. And that is what makes it so existential, but so much of an increased risk now for the interests of the Gulf states, which have been so enmeshed in globalization and the global economy. We're seeing that with disruptions to ammonia, to urea, to phosphates, to aluminum, to helium, that it's so enmeshed in the global economy that, unlike, say, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this is a conflict that basically has a stranglehold on the world economy, a literal choke point.
I mean, though, also, just if I can just small point,
please.
Oil, the fungibility of oil is something that Ken was talking about. There are substitutes. It's sometimes difficult to substitute one grade for another, and that's one of the reasons refineries in Asia are having a tough time. But the fungibility of these other commodities is not so strong, right? So there's not great substitutes for the fertilizer, for the amount of fertilizer coming out of the Gulf. It's going to be in short supply. Sulfur, 45% of the world's sulfur supply. So that's used in making semiconductors. That's used in metals refining. So copper, cobalt, nickel. Indonesia is scrambling to find sulfur so it can refine nickel and make batteries for electric vehicles, right? So this stuff has cascading effects across all sorts of different supply chains, affecting economies all over the place, touching everybody. By the time it touches the food supply, we start seeing agricultural yields going down. Yeah, this is the tentacles of this thing are really global, and not a lot of great substitutes. The one that does, I think, is natural gas. LNG has substitutes. So for countries that can substitute with coal or with some other burning liquids or something, but the others don't have great substitutes.
I'll go before I go on to Mohanadi for some comments. If we miraculously had a deal tomorrow, those commodities that you talked about, I mean, is there still going to be an economic impact? Are we already feeling what we've already experienced this last week or 2 weeks or so? If we had a deal tomorrow and all of this stuff was now free flowing, could we mitigate the economic blowback? Or do you think that's a fait accompli and this is going to roll out for the next few months? And if we miraculously had a deal tomorrow?
Right.
with the
No, I mean, I
people?
think it takes time to get this stuff moving again, but sure. I mean, the sooner the better, right? So, you know, to restart an LNG plant, you know, even if it's not damaged, it's going to take a few weeks to chill everything down, and you know, you got to move ships. I mean, these things take a long time to move in and out. So, I don't, you know, the sulfur is based on extraction from natural gas fields and oil fields. That, you know, in one case, the Shah field in Abu Dhabi has been hit, right, by an Iranian attack. So that's one of the key sources of the hydrogen sulfide that's making the sulfur. So there's going to have to be some repairs as well. So, you know, weeks and months, years in some cases for really heavy damage.
Oh, just one more thing very quickly. I'm sorry. Just in terms of at the beginning of the crisis, people were saying days, if not weeks. Now people are saying weeks, if not months. So, for example, with fertilizer, we now have the beginning of the Northern Hemisphere growing season for agriculture. So, I mean, we're going to see cascading effects if this crisis is not resolved soon. We're kind of at that tipping point where if it continues on for any length of time, those choke points and those bottlenecks will get much greater in their impact.
Yeah, can I just add very quickly in terms of fertilizer? It's not just a commercial consideration in the global north, but I saw that some of the most dependent on fertilizer through the Strait of Hormuz are the most food insecure countries in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Sudan, Somalia. So you're going to have potentially cataclysmic famine-like conditions in some parts of the global south. And I would say one other thing that we've seen before: when you have crises, even if they're mitigated in the short term, a lot of strategic planning then goes into finding alternative routes in the long term.
Yeah.
So you don't return to that again. So that could change the dynamics of this whole global economic model as well.
I was gonna thank you for raising that, Rory, because I agree 100%. You've already seen where diversification has been possible, that flex been taken. So, for example, in the oil space, we've seen Saudi Arabia, you know, start to exercise its maximum capability to move across the East-West pipeline across the Arabian Peninsula. There is going to be a significant amount of interest expressed, not just within the region, but by buyers of commodities outside of the region to invest in resilience in supply chain. So this is, how do we think of other routes out of the region than what we have right now? And what's interesting about that point, if you have diversification of outlets, if that had been the case coming into this conflict, I just want to put this on the table. Think about this. If that counterfactual world had actually been what we lived in now, where there were multiple alternative routes to move things, where is the currency in closing the strait? It doesn't exist. We're talking about a very different conflict and a very different sort of resolution path. So I think one of the things that's going to come out of the back end of this is a significant interest in expanding multiple pathways out of the region.
Rashid, I'd like to bring you in. You know, we're from our guests, they've said that geographically and economically, the Gulf states are, you know, they don't hold the cards necessarily. But do you think, given the traditional roles of mediators that particularly Qatar or Oman have with Iran and so on, that perhaps you do have some cards and you can step in to maybe diplomatically help resolve this situation?
Well, I think nobody is willing to mediate under fire, even though, you know, the last 4 or 5 days in Doha have been fairly quiet. You know, Iran hasn't officially mentioned or said or declared that Qatar is outside of its target list. So I think the roles of mediators get compromised when the mediators are under fire. We saw this when the Israelis tried to hijack the Gaza mediation by bombing Doha. So it's a difficult situation to be in, and I think the Gulf is in a state of, well, you know, as somebody living here, I think the level of resilience Gulf states showed in the face of thousands of missiles, thousands of drones being thrown at us, 2 fighter jets in the case of Qatar, in addition to other operations that have not been declared from the IRGC. You know, add to that all of the spy rings being dismantled in the Gulf, 2 in Qatar, and I guess one every week in Kuwait. The Gulf states do show a high level of resilience. but the Gulf states are still in a state of strategic shock. The assumption was if the US or the Israelis launch a strike, strikes would be limited towards US affiliated bases. Al-Udeid base in Qatar is a Qatari base that has a US contingent in and a NATO contingent in. It's not a sovereign base of the US. But we did assume that the Iranians might attack. What shocked us is that 60% of the attacks were on non-military targets. Ras Laffan, for example, I can share that some residential areas were targeted, but thankfully, because the Gulf invested heavily into layered air defense, we avoid mass casualty events. So look at Qatar, 200 missiles, 60% were on civilian targets. You can just imagine the potential of casualties if Qatar did not invest a lot in its layered air defense. And it comes back to this historical criticism of Gulf militaries being either palace guards or being inefficient or lavishly buying stuff. I think it shows that Gulf military planners, and I especially looking at the performances of the UAE and Qatar, did plan for this scenario, even though the diplomatic corps was focusing mostly on mediation and conflict resolution with the Iranians. So there's this balance. Commenting on the leverage, I think the Israelis did show that they do hold most of the leverage inside Washington. It will be interesting to see post-conflict how that would fall out because of the economic cost associated with this conflict globally. I also wanted to comment on some of the points mentioned by the esteemed panelists. I used to work in the LNG facility. I used to work in Ras Laffan, and sad enough, one of the units that were targeted was a unit I was taking care of. So it's a little bit personal from my side. Even if the straits are open today, there's structural damage to many of the facilities in the Gulf. And I think Qatar has been very transparent in talking about the damages. It's the only state that actually went out and said, this is the reduction in production. These are the units that were attacked, and these are the effects. I think post-conflict, many other Gulf states will come out with actual battle damage assessments, and we'll see structural effects on global supply. I totally agree with the fertilizer point. We did an internal assessment in the think tank I work with, and the exposure of Gulf fertilizer and Gulf feed into fertilizer production in mostly South Asia, the exposure to people is between 1.1 to 1.7 billion people, mostly either in Africa or in South Asia. So the food security aspect of this is very real. And maybe just to finish at this point, helium. And helium is something the world cannot replace. Qatar produces between 30 to 40% of global helium, depending on the time of year. I also worked in the helium plant for some time. Helium goes into MRI machines. Helium goes into rocketry. Helium goes into semiconductors. And talking to people working in the semiconductor industry and specifically memory chips, they are anticipating issuing force majeures to their buyers maybe in a month's time because they don't have enough helium. With hospitals, it's even worse because the price of packaged helium, because we sell helium in big containers, and then specialist gas companies then package them in smaller containers to sell to hospitals, doubled in price and halved in supply. So the health implications, and MRIs are life-saving, as everybody know. I think everybody unfortunately has been plagued either with a loved one or yourself with cancer, and the importance of MRIs. So the effects are global. The effects won't be rectified if suddenly Trump wakes up today and shakes the hand of the Iranians and they open the strait. I think we're looking at something in a more longer term. And I don't want to go into policy recommendations. I know it, but diversifying pathways out of the chokehold would be a policy priority for Gulf states after this.
You know, thank you. You know, you mentioned that the hit on the Gulf countries and the facilities was a little bit of a surprise. Do you think that, I don't know which one of you wants to comment on this first. From your standpoint, do you think there is a coherent strategy here? Or are we in escalation drift at this point? Do you think that from the American side that we're surprised?
So you know, talking to military personnel in the U.S. system, there was this assumption which was similar to us, that the focus would be on military installations. It's apparent that post the 12-day war, the regime in Iran decided that they would create a doomsday scenario to you know, regenerate deterrence when deterrence eventually fails, and this is by attacking the Gulf. You have to ask the question, why wasn't Azerbaijan hit as significantly as the Gulf, even though Azerbaijan has very deep relations with the Israelis? Because because of two things. One is domestic. I don't want to delve into it, but the Azeris constitute a big chunk of the Iranian, demographic mix. But second of all, the economic heat the globe will feel from hitting Azerbaijan is not like hitting Qatar or Abu Dhabi. So just to answer your question, I think from a military point of view, there has been a lot of mission creep. The end strategy was regime change, degrading military capacities and also degrading the nuclear potential. Securing the strait was something that wasn't part of the original plan, and now it has to be part of the original plan. So I think there's a lot of mission creep, and what I'm worried of is mission creep then moving towards more land operations.
Thank you. Let's talk about the major actors, China, India, and Russia. I mean, are they going to intervene diplomatically? We're not seeing that. Are they simply just going to absorb this shock and watch this happen? What is their standpoint?
So
I'd like to tackle that.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
Well,
please.
just to mention, the biggest loser outside of the region for this conflict are the Chinese. The Chinese import a big chunk of their oil from the region cheaply. They import LNG from Qatar. We have a 27-year contract with them, very cheap compared to what they get out of the spot market. They import Qatari helium, they import fertilizer, and the Gulf is a good consumer market for them. So the biggest, and this is something I wanted to mention earlier, we should look at what's happening, even though many of my American friends disagree with me, from a grand strategy point of view. Why did the US intervene in Venezuela? Why is the US intervening in Cuba? Why is the US intervening in Iran? And we cannot view this outside the lens of great power competition with the Chinese. So the Chinese are slowly losing friends, and they're losing oil producing friends. So to answer your question about the Chinese diplomatic, the Chinese historically have been very slow diplomatically. We've seen rhetoric coming out of Beijing, signaling the need for de-escalation. But I think most of the mediation efforts will be left on regional actors like Turkey and Pakistan at this stage, and the Chinese might support in the background.
Christian, Kenneth, Roy, please.
Can I just very quickly add? I mean, Rashid is 100% accurate in how he describes the vulnerabilities China has given its oil and gas relationships with the region. But when you look at it also from a grand strategic perspective, a leader has to be able to provide security, stability, and order for its followers. And the United States has been providing instability, insecurity, and disorder for its followers for many a year now. And what you're going to see is, as you see on many occasions on a smaller level, regional actors that would rather work with a stable United States that provides order and security are going to be pushed towards China because they have lost faith in the United States. And that's a very important strategic point beyond oil and gas. I mean, oil and gas is vital for economic growth and prosperity, but in terms of geopolitical relations, I do not think that China is particularly the loser in this case, any more than Russia is. India has a more difficult challenge in navigating these three bigger actors, but Russia and China, I think, on a geopolitical level, are lots of countries in the wider region or and the global context are looking and going, you know, what are these actors doing to destabilize our countries compared to the United States? On the other hand, neither of these countries have come to aid of Iran. And so, you know, you're going to see countries finding it very hard in the future to rely on any of these actors. But the United States has squandered much more goodwill than these others because it had much more to start with.
Well, if I could just chime in real quick here too. So there's a big vacuum. I think there's big opportunity for countries to become the adults in the room, if you will, and try and talk some of this down. But we've seen China during the Houthi closure of the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea cutting side deals for its own interest and its own ships, right? So this was, not a strategy that suggested, hey, it wants to protect the global maritime commons for use by all. It was more of a, let's get our own, let's pursue our own economic interests here. I think they had a big opportunity to demonstrate some magnanimity there, global leadership there that wasn't taken advantage of. So another opportunity this time. I mean, it's I think it remains to be seen how they'll embrace that or not.
Well, and also Chinese ships have been sailing in and out of Hormuz over the last 3 weeks as well. I mean, Hormuz is not completely closed, it's selectively closed. And so again, we see that element there. So I think if there were to be an agreement, international agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, if that were possible, it would need people to kind of guarantee that agreement. That might be where a country like China could play a role diplomatically going forward. But right now, they benefit from at least having access.
So I want to add one thing because I think it's good to focus on the implications for China just because of the heft of that country in geopolitical context, and economic context. But we can't forget about what sort of harm this is causing for countries like India. Pakistan was mentioned, a whole host of Southeast Asian economies that are heavily dependent on imports, not just of oil and gas, but also urea, fertilizers. I mean, we mentioned all of these things earlier, but when you look at the context of countries like the Philippines, for example, or India, they are hit very, very hard as a result of this. And that's generally what happens when you have these kinds of disruptions. They tend to hit the individuals in the countries that are lower on the economic development and income ladder than those that are higher. And I think that's something that we cannot forget because there is a very inequitable distribution of pain as a result of what we're seeing. That's why I think you've seen in the background some of those countries actually trying to step into that mediator role because they have more to lose, quite frankly. I think Pakistan was mentioned in that capacity. India has been attempting to make inroads there because the LPG issues that almost nobody seems to want to talk about for India are very, very real, and they don't have an alternative source of supply. So you're talking about something that renders major economic implications for a very large and rapidly growing economy. So that's an area we need to really pay close attention to.
So from your standpoints, I mean, the energy trade has always been a feature of warfare, but do you think we're in a new paradigm now where we're in an era of the weaponization of energy? Is that clearly where we are? You mentioned something about, taking, removing the leader of Venezuela, what we're doing now in the Gulf. Do you think this is part of a strategy?
So energy has always been weaponized when it's convenient, right? And anytime you have great powers engaged in conflict, you'll actually see energy used as a lever, but it's not the only lever. And I think it's inappropriate to boil this down to just a discussion of oil in China, because I do agree with what Rashid said. There is a bigger strategy here, but it's not just about those two things. So I think it's really important that we not speculate too much on that front, because quite frankly, there's a lot of information that has not been divulged. I think it will come to light eventually, but there is a lot more going on here. I'll just say that. I think it's impossible to ignore the fact that these things have happened in a particular sequence, with a very directed action, and there are multiple points of confluence. If you just sit down and really think deeply about what's actually happening in the background. So it doesn't mean we can't talk about the energy implications, the economic implications. Those are all very real, right? So I think that's where we have the most to add, just to be blunt. But when it comes to motivations, quite frankly, that's what is lending itself to so much uncertainty in the current environment, is nobody has come out and said explicitly what they need to do. And by the way, because this is not a declaration of war type of action from the United States government, there is no requirement for the administration to state what its motives are. If this was actually a declaration of war that the Congress was involved in, then that would be a very different type of outcome. So there's some interesting little nuances here that are sort of helping to motivate what we're seeing. So
I would, if I can add just a little brief, so weaponizing energy is a key factor of all conflicts, right? I mean, you don't have to destroy your enemy's tanks and ships and planes. You just have to deny them fuel and they can't operate them. It's just as good, right? But that's not what's happening here. This is Iran using denial of energy and food, by the way, to the global economy as a deterrent, right? This is not the normal use of energy, or the normal weaponization of energy. This is putting economic pressure on the U.S., through this circuitous route of depriving the entire world of energy and food. So I think this one, yes, I think we can say this is a new wrinkle here.
But if I could make one just point on that, when we talked about leverage earlier on, when were the Gulf states most potentially effective in using energy for leverage? And that would have been as a group to basically measure on their energy production and really scared the world at an early stage. Now, the GCC is not unified in that regard. It never has been on energy and other key national security interests, but that could have been a potential opportunity for the Gulf states to leverage Washington early on. Secondly, I would say in regard to that, the fact that they chose not to, it demonstrates that, they're still determined to demonstrate the reliability as producers that can be relied on regardless of the geopolitical environment they're operating in. And thirdly, of course, it also minimizes others watching the effectiveness of major oil producers and gas producers from influencing geopolitical decisions. So I think, just to build on what Jim said, the other side of that is, yes, it's new in regards to how how the denial of energy has been thought about, but also those who have energy have been ineffective in using it or chosen not to use it in an extreme way in order to try and leverage it. And I think that's interesting here too.
So do you each, maybe because I know we're running a little bit out of time. It sounds like this is not a contained disruption, and that this is now having global impacts with possibly unmanageable impacts that we've yet to see, but you've outlined some of those. So do you each believe, and I'll start with each of you, do you think that this is going to be a prolonged situation from what you're seeing today? Do you think that this could be resolved in 3 months, a week, 6 months? What is your insight telling you? And maybe I could start with Rashid, from where you sit.
Well, sitting here a few hundred kilometers away from Iranian ballistic missile launchers and drones, I hope that the situation gets resolved quicker rather than later. Unfortunately, what we see is some level of very cautious optimism with the current mediation activities happening, apparently led by Pakistan and Turkey. There are structural challenges where the Israelis and the US have assassinated a big number of leadership. So having proper and influential interlocutors into the Iranian system has appeared to be a challenge. I think, the strategic options for Iran, and this is from a military and strategic point of view, the strategic options of Iran have become very limited. They have one winning card, which is the Strait of Hormuz and causing some regional mayhem every now and then. So if the regime in Iran was thinking strategically, striking a deal with Trump now, especially where they seem the appetite to continue the war is decreasing, would be the most strategically sound thing. But there are domestic considerations, so I think it's difficult to tell. Some people are saying days, if not weeks. I would say weeks, if not months, to fully conclude this conflict. But the way this concludes will give us a segue on how things will continue. If this concludes with the Iranian regime staying intact, then that is a worry, because this is a regime that attacked our livelihood and attacked our civilian infrastructures and closed our straits. If Iran collapses due to internal and external pressure, then we have a failed state that has 100 million people a few kilometers away from us in a very shallow water, which also is a security risk. However this conflict concludes, it won't be a good conclusion, and I think the Gulf states will have to adapt and change, in response to how this conflict ends. But also grand revisions on relationships with the US, with Europe. I think Gulf Europe relations will increase and surge in the upcoming years, and also the role of China in the Gulf might increase if the Chinese show that they're serious about becoming a protector of global norms, which unfortunately, as an observer here, I don't see them doing that job at this stage.
Wow. Would anybody like to add to that as we close this amazing conversation out? Christian?
Go ahead, Christian.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to say, I mean, with President Trump, it's almost not even day by day, it's hour by hour, trying to understand what he's thinking, what every Truth Social means. I mean, we had over the weekend the 48-hour ultimatum, which made me extremely concerned that we were on the cusp of an escalation that would be catastrophic in terms of its impact. We now have this 5-day pause. But you could read into that two things. One is that the president might be looking for an exit strategy or an off-ramp because the economic pain is increasing, or, as we have seen, it buys time to send additional forces, including forces specializing in taking strategic locations to the region. So, I mean, this is, I think, also what regional states in the Gulf and others are struggling with, to understand a decision-making process in the White House, which seems to veer from one to the other so rapidly. And of course, for the Gulf states, the risk of escalation is so dangerous for them. So that's another level of incomprehension they're trying to layer in to this level of conflict.
Jim, were you going to add to that?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I think at the end of the day here, I think Iran's interest is in letting this conflict play out for a while longer here, because if it stops prematurely, we're going to see this mowing of the grass situation where the Israelis are going to come in and 6 months and do the same thing all over again, right? So I think they would like to establish some kind of level of more permanent deterrence so that this conflict, it doesn't just start up, every time, the political, the stars line up. So I think for the Gulf, I think the Gulf countries, don't want to have this conflict fought in their territories, every 6 months as well. So, it's strange as it is to say this, but I mean, I think, for security in the Gulf, Iran needs to have some sort of deterrence And until it can get that in some way, it probably isn't. It's not going to be in its interests to call this off, to agree to a ceasefire.
What do you think is in the U.S.'s interests to finally take that off ramp? What would it take from the U.S. side? So far, it isn't rising gas prices, and the stock market's doing okay. And unfortunately, I think there have been 7 lives from is it 7 or 6 on the U.S. side? And I know we have troops on their way there. God forbid if we have boots on the ground, is it going to be the body bags? Is it what is it going to take for the U.S. to finally take that off ramp?
I'd say anyone's guess.
I'll chime in there a little bit. Yeah, no problem. I'll sort of comment first on trying to understand the motivations of the administration. I think that's a bit of a fool's errand. First of all, this president has communicated in fits and starts. It's very different than any president we've had in recent history. And a lot of it is misdirection, right? So you'll often see things said on the one hand to grab attention and then something done differently. So I would not try to interpret anything that's going on in a literal sense, as odd as that might sound, right? But I think that becomes fraught with all kinds of difficulty and, quite frankly, plays into the strategy, if there is one, that is unfolding. In terms of off-ramps, I think there's a really important point to raise here. For the Iranian regime, this is ideological and existential. For the Israelis, it's ideological and existential. For the US government, it's neither. So when you start thinking about sides that the US actually is playing and the pain that is ultimately inflicted as a result of a continuing conflict, there is a point at which the US just says, we're done. And that is actually a really dangerous proposition to contemplate, because it does leave the region in a serious state of upheaval. And I think that's where there's going to have to be some intervention by more than just the US long term for this to actually be on the back end of it, something that is a more stable, sort of less fraught with risk type of environment. That's where I think, and it was good to hear Rashid actually comment on, it's going to be a priority for other routes out, because economically this is damaging. And as we start to think about, even if there is, in the 2 cases that Rashid laid out, which I think he's absolutely right, both of those are not good. But even if there is a case where that unfolds, the investment environment is going to be much more focused on trying to get away from the region in as many different ways as possible. It's going to force a refocus of sovereign wealth into the region to help sort of develop those alternative routes out. It's going to pull international capital in. And I think the irony of all of that is that could be a stabilizing force long term, because you're going to see a lot more international interest in terms of physical dollars and euros and won and everything else being invested in the region to ensure that that critically vital trade hub, which it has been for centuries, this is not new, this is not unique to oil, right, remains intact and remains functional. So I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of pain that will ultimately yield a better outcome in the long run. But I think we're far short of actually understanding what that long run looks like, and the pain that we're still going to be facing over the next weeks or months, as was commented, is not going to subside quickly.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end it on that, because you've given us a bit of a glimmer of some hope for the long run. I want to thank Gulf Times. I want to thank Faisal for convening us. I think we need to have this discussion again, because to everyone's point, it's almost an hour by hour change and a day by day. maybe we could get together very soon and look back and discuss how this is ended and now the rebuilding begins. So thank you very much, Rashid. I've been to Ras Laffan several times. My first time in 2004, and it also hit me quite personally to see that devastation. And my best wishes for Qatar and Qatari people to. The resilience that you have is very well known, and we hope for the best.
Thank
Faisal.
you, Aida. Thank you, Kristen, Keith, Roy, Jim, Rashid. Really a pleasure. And as we said, we will have another season, logistic and aviation. And really a pleasure for attending this event.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good day.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.